Okay, so it's the standard view about Americans that we are fundamentally polarized, politically divided. Here's Gallup's poll from the beginning of the year, asking what the top issues for Americans are. And you can see in this division the standard way in which we perceive Republicans differing from independents and Democrats. So if you look at the top 10 list for Republicans, number 9 is the rich-poor gap. That's number 6 for independents, number 6 for Democrats. Number 6 is the ethics moral problem. I don't know what that is, but okay, there it is. That's number 9 for independents, number 7 for Democrats. Number 4 on the Republicans list is the federal deficit. That's number 5 for independents, of course, number 9 for Democrats. But the interesting thing about this chart is the line which I've obscured here. Because what's striking about this chart is that though we differ in a million ways, we all agree about what the number one issue is, the number one problem. Number one problem we all agree about is government. That's characterized by Gallup as dissatisfaction with government, Congress, politicians, poor leadership, corruption, abuse of power. And that finding was consistent with findings we had discovered through some polls done by the Global Strategy Group at the end of last year. So we asked, do you think our current political system works well? Do you think the system is in need of reform? 80% thought it was in need of reform. Do you think the system is corrupt? 71% thought it was corrupt. How important is it to you that the influence of money in politics be reduced? 96% thought it important that the influence of money in politics be reduced. 96%. Now, why people think that differs depending on their politics. So if you're a conservative, I'm sorry, I just broke the computer. That's interesting. If you're a conservative, people like Palin or Paul, you worry about something called crony capitalism. So the Cato Institute, libertarian think tank in Washington, does a study every year calculating their estimate of the total cost of corporate welfare in the federal budget. Corporations deserve food stamps too. They're people too. So corporations get food stamps. They get, no, they don't really. Come on, where are you guys? Hey, wake up. They don't get food stamps, but they get lots of other benefits from special privileges built into the law. That's what Cato thinks of as corporate welfare. The total cost for corporate welfare last year, $100 billion. $100 billion, which if it were a check that the average voter were writing to the cronies of Congress in order to get them to pay for the cost of campaigns, that would work out to $762.52 per person. There it is. John Q. Public has signed this check. That amount of money represents the subsidy back to these corporations, which the corporations then turn around and make available to politicians to help them fund their campaigns in certain ways. This is what they refer to as crony capitalism. Some of the finest crony capitalism in America you can find in any major democracy because of the way we're raising money or ways congressmen raise money. Here's another way in which you can think about it. The Wall Street Journal was puzzled at the end of 2010 because of the explosion of these temporary tax provisions in the tax code. So you have these provisions that say the depreciation rate for the following sort of capital will be at a certain rate, lower than the standard rate. But those provisions have an automatic sunsetting provision. So they say that this will expire on a certain day. And after they expire, then the question is whether Congress will extend them. And when Congress does extend them, it's called an extender. They're very creative in Congress about how to name things. So extending it is called an extender. So what the Wall Street Journal is puzzled by was the rise in extenders. Like, well, what the heck's going on? Why are there so many extenders here? Which is another way of saying, why are there so many temporary tax provisions here? Well, it turns out the first temporary tax provision was created by Ronald Reagan in his 1981 Tax Reform Act. There was a research and development tax credit. And it was made temporary so as to test whether it worked. Democrats said it wouldn't work. Republicans said it would work. They said, hey, let's just try it. And we'll ask a bunch of economists to evaluate it. And once the economists evaluate it, we'll do what the economists say. So if the economists say it works, we'll make it permanent. If the economists say it doesn't work, we'll get rid of it. So after a period of time, they evaluated it and asked the question, did it work? And the economists said it did work. It made sense, absolutely made sense, because it incentivized a certain kind of investment that otherwise would not have been made. So the net return was effective and positive for the economy. But here's the puzzle about that 1981 tax innovation. It is still temporary to this day. Still temporary to this day. So why is it temporary to this day? Well, Rebecca Kaisar, writing in the Georgia Law Review, writes this: the principal recipients of the research credit are large U.S. manufacturing corporations. These business entities are more than willing to invest in lobbying activities and campaign donations to assure the continuance of these large tax savings. So here's the dynamic as described by this libertarian think tank, Institute for Policy Innovation. The cycle has repeated for years. Congress allows the credit to lapse until another short extension is given, preceded, of course, by a series of fundraisers and speeches about the importance of nurturing innovation. Congress essentially uses this cycle to raise money for re-election, promising industry more predictability the next time around. So the point is, you architect, you as Congress, if you're trying to maximize the ability to raise money, you architect the tax code so that benefits to rich people expire, so that the rich people, corporations, have a strong incentive to get you to extend those benefits, and they manifest that desire through the traditional Washington way of giving money to your campaigns. So the more temporary provisions targeted in this way that you can roll into the tax code, the more reliable is your ability to raise money for your campaigns. Or here's another example, very well known among doctors. The Medicare reimbursement for doctors was supposed to go down over time. And the reason it's supposed to go down is to give an incentive for doctors to become more efficient. So each year, when they passed this statute setting out this provision, the reimbursement was supposed to drop. But each year, doctors come to Congress and say, hey, don't let it drop. Please keep it up. And the congressmen say, well, you know, we're going to have to get some support to really convince members of Congress that it makes sense to keep the reimbursement up. So they have fundraisers and they have all these lobbyist meetings and so forth to keep the reimbursement rate up. In the 17 years since this provision was put into law, 17 years where the reimbursement rates were supposed to fall, they have never fallen once. Every year, Congress passes what's called the doc fix, which is change the law to make it so the reimbursement rates don't go down. And when they do that, it's exactly this dynamic. There have been a bunch of doctor fundraisers where the doctors have dumped a whole bunch of money into the political system in order to incentivize them to do the doc fix. Now, what conservatives typically call something like this is extortion. Extortion, because you can understand the dynamic here. You imagine a member of Congress coming to you saying, you know, happy to help you as long as you kick the money into the system we need. Shakedown, extortion. And sometimes it gets to be quite explicit. So this is a lesson for future Congress people. Never leave a voice message. Okay? Eleanor Holmes Norton didn't know this.
This is Eleanor Norton, Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton. I noticed that you have given to other colleagues on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. I am a senior member, a 20-year veteran, and am chair of the Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, and Emergency Management. I'm handling the largest economic development project in the United States now, the Homeland Security compound of 3 buildings being built on the old St. Elizabeth's Hospital site in the District of Columbia, along with 15 other sites here that are part of the stimulus. I was frankly surprised to see that we don't have a record, so far as I can tell, of your having given to me, despite my long and deep work. In fact, it's been my major work.
Okay, this is just embarrassing. Okay, but you get the basic point. This is the sense in which people feel there's a shakedown that's created by the system where these people have to raise money, so they turn to the people who benefit from what Congress does, and they say, give us the money we need to continue to have the power we have to give you the benefit you want. So that's extortion and crony capitalists. Because of the way Congress made money, that's what the conservatives worry about. Liberals worry about different things. This guy's obviously a liberal, right? So his name is Jonathan Cohn. He writes for the New Republic. He wrote this fantastic piece about how Obama got Obamacare, really incredible after the victory account. So it turns out how they did it didn't involve a lot of change, right? It was the same old system, deal time, for getting legislation passed. But the deals were struck with powerful interests who threatened massive spending to destroy the Democratic Party if the deals were not granted. So, for example, pharma, remember represented by Jennifer, she's not here today, so I'm going to pick on pharma. Pharma has a special deal in Obamacare. The deal is that when the government gets prescription drugs from pharma, it doesn't get to negotiate the price. So we basically pay retail for wholesale purchases of drugs. This is the same thing that was in the Prescription Drug Act that the Bush administration had passed. So this is no price negotiation on these drugs. This is a pretty important benefit to pharma. The benefit is about $100 billion. So take crony capitalism times 2. Or think about the insurance companies. The insurance companies were terrified there would be a public option in Obamacare, basically the government offering its own insurance policy that would compete against the private insurance policies. They were really, really terrified about this. There was lots of pretty direct threats that if, in fact, there were a public option, there would be millions spent to destroy the Democratic Party. So there's no public option in Obamacare. That estimated to cost $150 billion. So take crony capitalism now times 3.5. This is the sort of thing that gets liberals upset because these major reforms only ever happen, as Robert Reich puts it, when we buy off all the interests who have the capacity to destroy the Democratic Party. These kind of reforms come lots from Democrats, sometimes from Republicans. That's prescription drug thing of Bush. But again, this is driven by the way in which we raise money for congressmen. Okay, so that's what liberals worry about. So you can think that's what conservatives care about, what liberals care about. Of course, the most important thing is what do law professors care about. And law professors look at this, and the reason we care about this is something we've talked about again and again, is because of the corruption the system manifests. You understand that argument. But you can see when you add conservatives, liberals, and law professors together why we get to such a strong, overwhelming consensus that there's something wrong about the way in which we're raising money in the system to fund elections for members of Congress. Okay. But how does that system actually affect what Congress does? How? What's the mechanism? And as you would have seen from the reading, there's some people who think it doesn't. This guy, notice his nice smile. This is Bradley Smith. So Bradley Smith was the chairman of the Federal Election Commission. And I was debating him once on the radio about the effect of money in politics, and this is what he said. Quote, "The evidence is pretty overwhelming that the money does not play much of a role in what goes on in terms of legislative voting patterns and legislative behavior. The consensus about that among people who've studied it, not Lessig, but people who've studied it, is roughly the same as the consensus among scientists that global warming is taking place." Right? So I am the equivalent in this argument of a global warming denier, right? And his claim is every sane scientist knows there's no evidence that money is affecting legislative results. No evidence. And even though there's a smile here, he wasn't joking. That's what he seriously believes. Okay, now, turns out the source for this view is an incredibly important paper written by some incredibly brilliant professors who happen to be at this incredible university called Harvard, at least two of them. This paper, which raised this question, why is there so little money in US politics? Part of the motivation for that question is the recognition that the government gives out all sorts of benefits, but the amount of money that's actually being spent to get those benefits seems to be way below what would be spent if in fact those contributions were buying those benefits. Or put it a different way, Congress is selling, if Congress is in fact selling the House, they're selling the House really cheap, really, really cheap, too cheap, way below what the benefit would be. So for example, sugar is protected in the American market by a tariff. There's a tariff that protects the domestic sugar industry. That increases the profits to sugar manufacturers by about $3 billion. But the total contribution from sugar barons to members of Congress and their campaigns is no more than about $4 million. So you're saying they're spending $4 million, they're getting $3 billion in return. That's a pretty high return on investment. And that led these authors to wonder, does that suggest maybe that there isn't a relationship between the money spent and the results? Because if there were, you'd think that the price would be much higher. So what they did is they reviewed all the studies that tried to find a relationship between PAC contributions and roll call votes. So when Congress passes a statute, the final vote is typically a roll call vote, meaning everybody has to stand up and say which side they're on. So they tried to measure the relationship between PAC contributions and roll call votes. Now, first question to flag, why would they look at roll call votes? They got to the end of the process. And what's the thing about roll call votes? It's tied to your name, so it's good data, really good data, right? So, this is the standard joke about the economist, lost his keys, standing on the light, looking at the keys. Somebody says, why are you looking for your keys here? He said, well, this is where the light is. Get it? You guys don't get any jokes. I don't get it. Get it? So here's where the light is. This is where I'm looking. But, the keys could be anywhere. But this is where he's looking. And that's what this is about, right? The claim is we can measure roll call votes because we know it's a roll call. Your name is tied to the vote. So we can measure it, and we can tie it to a contribution. OK, now, anybody who spent time in Congress? Not as a congressperson, I know, but anybody on the Hill as a legislative aide or something like that? You're sort of, right? OK, so between roll call vote and contribution, how many steps are there?
Depends on what you count, but formal steps, 10 or 12 more, dozens if you look it up.
Right, so you imagine somebody has an idea for legislation. There's the idea. There's the, let's talk about it, let's get it drafted, let's get it introduced to a committee, let's get a hearing on it in the committee, let's get it out of the committee, let's get it to the floor, let's get a vote on it in the floor, let's get it to the other house, let's get a vote on it in the other house, let's get it to the president, let's get the president to sign it. And along the way, there are thousands of places where influence might be exerted. Now, how many of those places have nice, clean data associated with them? Almost none. Almost none. So the point is, this is the way to think about it. There's one place where influence can't hide. That's at the very end. But there are 1,000 places between the inception of an idea and that place where influence can't hide, where influence can hide very easily because nobody can observe it. You can't see that a chairman has decided to kill a bill because of influence, because there's nothing to measure. There's no recording. I decided to kill this bill. It just doesn't go forward. It's a decision made that doesn't have a record associated with it. So the point is, they're measuring what they can measure, and based on what they can measure, they conclude there isn't a way to demonstrate a relationship between roll call votes and contributions. If they said, you look at PAC contributions show relatively few effects. In 3 out of 4 instances, campaign contributions had no statistically significant effect on legislation or had the wrong sign, meaning you contributed, but the likelihood of it passing went down. As they concluded, indicators of party ideology and district preference account for most of the systemic variation in legislators' roll call voting behavior. Interest group contributions account for at most a very small amount of the variation. In fact, after controlling adequately for legislator ideology, these contributions have no detectable effects on legislative behavior. Okay, so they say there is no detectable effect on legislative behavior. Do you have a question about that? Okay.
So last class you said that it actually helped when voters, when you anonymize poll booths. But if we were to try to do that here, it seems like there could be massive problems. Can you talk about why? Like, what about the dynamics? What about our standards is different here?
You mean if you anonymized what congressmen were doing?
Mm-hmm. So you're saying there is a lot of anonymity in the middle, and then there's not in the end. And what we have right now is very problematic.
Right, great point. So I'm going to bracket that, though, because I want to get through this, and we'll come back to this point about how the change in anonymity might change the effect. But I want to make sure that one important part of this dynamic is clear first. Okay, so let's hold that for 1 second. So they're saying there's lots of places. There's the one place we can actually measure, we see no effect. Now, from that, can you say there is no effect? Why not? Yeah, and are they saying there is no effect? They can't see the effect, right? It's like, you take a drone and you put it over Catholic churches and you say, I don't see any abuse of children inside the Catholic churches, so therefore there is no abuse in the Catholic Church. No, you can't infer the one from the other because you're just saying this mode of looking doesn't show it. And that's all they were saying. But people like Brad Smith grab this and they translate this into there is no effect. There is no effect. The Harvard professors have told us that. Right? That's not what the Harvard professor said. The Harvard professor said we can't see that effect. And what we know is there's lots of other places where it would make a lot of sense to exercise your influence because it can't be seen there. The last thing in the world you'd want to do is to demonstrate you are subject to influence by in the only public place where it's actually recorded showing that kind of influence. Now, the really interesting question your name is? Nikath has raised is, what's the relationship between this and anonymity? Okay, because there's lots of anonymous places in the middle and no anonymity at the other end. But there's a difference between what we could say symmetrical and asymmetrical anonymity. Right? So in the middle, we don't know what's going on, but the insiders do know what's going on. Right? So if you imagine the lobbyist is having an effect in the middle, in the anonymous space, the lobbyist and the congressperson, they know what's going on, but we don't. Right? So that's asynchronous anonymity, asymmetric anonymity. It's anonymous for us, not for them. But in the context of voting booths, it's symmetrical, right? There's nobody who knows. I mean, the person who votes knows, but there's no way that person can signal to anybody else how that person's voting because it's perfectly symmetrical. Right? So the reason why the voting booth undermines the capacity for corruption is that it's symmetrical anonymity. If it were asymmetrical, it would be a great opportunity for corruption because there could be a deal struck. Like if you could bring the person buying your vote into the voting booth with you and you could see the vote you've cast, that would be asymmetrical anonymity. The public wouldn't know, but you guys would know. Then there'd be lots of encouraging for selling votes once again. So the anonymity is only effective if nobody knows. If nobody knows, then it can be useful to destroy the opportunity for these kind of deals. But if one side knows and the public doesn't know, that encourages the opportunity for those deals. And that would be the same thing going on here. Okay?
You're saying if a congressman
Yeah, so so if what, and I don't want to say this is what happens, but let's say this is what happens, okay? Congressman gets a call from a lobbyist. The lobbyist is like, Congressman, we'd love to have a fundraiser for you. Oh, that's so great. Yeah, no, we think we can bring in a couple $100,000. Oh, that's fantastic. What can I do for you? I said, well, we have this particular bill. We'd like to get it killed. Okay, so the Congressman and the lobbyist are having this conversation, a desire to get this bill killed. And then the bill gets killed by this congressperson. How does it get killed by this congressperson? The congressperson's on the committee, maybe the chairman of the committee, and just doesn't bring the bill out of committee. Just lets it die. So the lobbyist and the congressperson know what's gone on there. But you can't know. I can't know. All we know is the chairman didn't bring it out of the committee. The chairman could have not brought it out of the committee for a million reasons. It could have been a bad idea. Could be there are other busy things to do. Could be he doesn't like it. Could be a majority in Congress doesn't like it. There are 1,000 reasons why it didn't leave committee. So you and I can't know that it didn't leave committee because of this influence exercised by the lobbyist. But the lobbyist and the congressperson know, and they better know, right? Because the lobbyist isn't going to be able to brag to the client unless the lobbyist knows. The congressperson is not going to be able to assure that there's the desire to run the fundraiser unless the lobbyist knows. So those guys have got to know if the mechanism is going to work, but the rest of us won't know. That's the way in which this asymmetrical anonymity doesn't, in fact, encourages the kind of corruption we're talking about. Okay, so here's where we are. These Harvard geniuses say we can't show it, given what we can look at. The public says, or some of the public say, therefore it's not there. But of course, the first point is that doesn't follow. And then the second point is there's a bunch of other, he's not from Harvard, all right, I get that. But there's a bunch of other people who've looked at this data and begin to say, well, in fact, we think you can show this effect. So Stratman did a different kind of meta-analysis of all the reported findings. The meta-analysis performed here suggests that money does indeed influence votes, but they want to say that, and again, they're looking at roll call votes, so even you can show it with roll call votes. You don't want to overstate the results. This is work by Clayton Peoples, just has been published in the last 6 weeks. Growing consensus that despite the mixed literature, contributions do indeed influence roll call voting. What is interesting, though, is that there is also an increasing acknowledgement that not all bills are the same in terms of influence. Moreover, there's an emerging stream of thought that roll call votes are not the only, nor perhaps even the most important form of contribution influence. Okay, the last point is something we've just said. But this point about not all bills being the same, what would that point? What's the insight there? You can respond. It's not a joke, so you can respond. Go ahead. Yeah. Yes, right there.
Some bills will be like, they'll be like interest bills, like the sugar or something, where you're sort of sneaking in and then moving into some bill, or maybe not even sneaking it in, but like it's a sort of interest-based bill. But other bills will be some sort of party line issue, like Obamacare, like if you're a Republican.
Right. Right. There's some bills that are so boring, the only people who care about it are the lobbyists and the companies affected by it. So nobody is going to follow those kinds of idiotic bills. Like, who cares about them? And the claim that Peoples is making is when you distinguish between low visibility legislation and legislation that everybody's going to know something about, we're all going to be paying attention to what our congressperson does about this legislation, there's less of an effect demonstrated with the high visibility bills, but with the low visibility bills, there's a much higher effect demonstrated. So people are saying there is an effect, and it's pronounced in the context of bills that people are not watching. And then he says, Fallows and Wolf shed more light on the relationship. In their study, examined influence of contributions of both PACs and business people. What they find is that business contributions affecting voting on regulatory changes in tax codes, those are the boring things, but not on other types of legislation, have an effect. Their explanation for this difference fits with what we've just said. He said, quote, we find these results to be entirely consistent with the view of rationality in which representatives seek to trade votes for campaign contributions without the appearance of an embarrassing quid pro quo. And there's no appearance because nobody sees it, because nobody cares about it, nobody's following it. So if there's a place where there's an interference, you're going to see this tight connection. It's going to be on these relatively invisible bills. They're not insignificant. You know, a tax code change could cost billions. So it's not insignificant. It's just boring. That's sort of thing that nobody's going to be following. But the more interesting thing that Peoples talks about, and I want to emphasize this idea because it's really fundamental. We've seen the Supreme Court talk about corruption as a quid pro quo. Quid pro quo is the language we usually use to talk about contracts. I'm going to give you $1,000 if you paint my house. So this for that. And contracts like that feel like they're one-off deals. Quid pro quo is on eBay. I need to buy, some baseball card. I see it on eBay. I don't know anything about baseball cards, but I take it people buy them, right? So they buy them on eBay. So there it is, the baseball card. I fill it out and I click PayPal and there it is, I get the baseball card. One-shot deal. But people saying here that, in fact, the way influence happens in Washington is not kind of a lobbyist who shows up who's never met a congressperson and tries to strike a deal about a particular bit of legislation. Nobody walks in and says, hi, you've never met me, but I've got a fundraiser if you've got to vote on a certain piece of legislation. That never happens. Or if it does, those people are idiots and they get locked up pretty quickly, okay? Instead, what he says happens is that it's much more indirect. It's influence more like the way people give gifts to create influence. Right? So if you have a friend and it's your friend's birthday, it's a pretty bad gift. I mean, you might not think so, but we all think it's a bad gift if your friend just walks up and says, here's $25. Happy birthday. Because it doesn't really express his or her understanding of you. It's too quid pro quo-ish, right? It's just too transparent. So instead what you do is you give a gift, and then when it's your birthday, you kind of expect something in return. Now, you would never be crass enough to say, the thing I gave you was worth $45. This thing's only worth 20. Right? But when you're buying the gift in exchange for the gift you got, you're certainly thinking, what was that thing worth? Right? This is an economy. This is the gift economy. Lots of people have written about this gift economy, but the point is it's much more subtle. It depends upon very sophisticated relationships in the sense that you know the other person, you deal with them repeatedly, there's ongoing back and forth, it goes on and on and on. And within the context of that relationship, you can exert very significant influence, but it never looks like this for that. Never looks like this for that. You give a gift one day, 6 months later, you get something back. So you say, Congressman, I'm going to have a fundraiser for you. Oh, that's wonderful. There's the fundraiser. 2 months later, you walk into the congressman's office, you say, we really need some help on this legislation. When you say we really need some help on this legislation, you don't say, remember we had that fundraiser. You don't say, and we'd love to have another fundraiser. That would be a crime. But if all you do is show up and say, we need help on this bill, the congressman's not an idiot, I promise. He's not. Really, it's true. They're not idiots. Well, okay. But mostly, they're not idiots, right? They know this is what they're good at. They're going to know how to remember, how to connect. And if they don't, they've got a really great staffer who is keeping a list. Right? So in my book, I talk about this woman who's trying to get some support for child welfare for children, for school lunch program like thing. And she goes into a congressperson's office. She's wealthy. She goes into the congressperson's office, and they talk about this. And then she walks out of the office, and on the way down the Capitol stairs, her phone rings. And it's the finance director for that congressperson who says, we'd really like to have a fundraiser out at your house in California. Do you think you can arrange that for us? Right now, nobody's making a reference to anything, but nobody's an idiot here. They get it. Like, okay, you've just asked the congressperson for something. Now we're asking for something from you. And if you don't make it transparent, it's not illegal. It's not insulting. But if you do make it transparent, I'm going to do this for that, that is illegal, and it is insulting. It kind of demeans the other person. Like, the only reason you're doing this is for the money. Well, of course the only reason I'm doing it for the money, but I never would say that. that would mean I'm not really in it for the public good. It means I'm just in it for my own private benefit. So we're not going to talk like that. Instead, we're going to create this nice illusion that what we're doing is for the purpose of our own separate wonderful spheres. That's what they're talking about, is this gift economy. And the point is, if you model it as a gift economy, it becomes really hard to imagine how you're going to track the relationship between influence and result. Like, what would it even look like? What would the data be that you would get to show that the lobbyist did something here and 6 months later the lobbyist got something there? So to the extent you're looking for the statistical analysis that shows you that there is this kind of effect, it's not likely in that context you're going to see it. So that's the conclusion here. Contributions do indeed influence policymaking, but the influence flows in ways that do not necessarily match public perception of the issue. Contributions are never rewarded with an explicitly promised return. However, contributions are frequently part of an ongoing implicit exchange that provides contributors many favorable benefits and impacts multiple stages of the legislative process, from committee services to roll call votes. And indeed, Clayton, people's own work, looking at 91 to 96, a different period from the period that Ansel Behere was looking at, found a statistically significant contributor influence in 7 of the 8 houses that he was looking at. So that, again, point is that there are people who do see some influence. Then one last point I want to sort of introduce here to get you to see how hard this would be. This is a really great paper, one of the, well, certainly would be one of the most important papers in this area, called the iceberg effect. So here's the iceberg effect. The intuition suggesting the iceberg is that you will only ever see part of the funder influence. You won't see all of the funder influence, and here's why. They have this nice empirical model, theoretical model, which they then back up with some empirical analysis to demonstrate that my influence on you by giving you $10,000 is equivalent, roughly equivalent, depending on how credible this is, to me giving you $2,000 and threatening to give your opponent $8,000. So if I can credibly threaten, so you really believe me, I'm going to give your opponent $8,000, and I give you $2,000, you're going to reward me just as much as if I gave you $10,000. Okay, so if that's true, what does that suggest your optimal strategy to minimize your expenditures yet maximize your influence would be? It means you would give a lot of threats and minimal contributions. Right? So you'll be contributing a little bit amount of money, you'll be threatening a big amount of money elsewhere, and if those threats are credible, it'll be just as effective as if you spent all that money in influence. Okay, but then where are the threats recorded? Like, what's the form you fill out with the FEC to register your threat to give money to somebody else? That wasn't a joke, but you laughed. Okay, so right. There is no form. Obviously, there's no form. So if you're asking the question, will we be able to look at the data and see the influence, here's a really big reason why you're never going to look at the data and see the influence, because the most important component of the influence is, by definition, invisible to the system. The threats are invisible to the system. So that's why, again, you might see not so much money in politics, but lots of influence in politics, because most of the money is below the waterline. It's the part of the iceberg you don't see, the threats that are never actually paid, but still have pretty significant influence. Okay, that's in the section about whether, in fact, there is an influence. But I want to say, let's assume Ansel is right for what they say. Assume it doesn't. There is no demonstration of the relationship between contributions and roll call votes. There's at least 2 clear ways in which there is an effect, and 1 clear way in which there's a consequence which we, from a public perspective, need to worry about. One way in which there clearly is an effect is distraction. So if I asked you to imagine the first quarter of 2011, and tell me what was the most important issue that Congress addressed first quarter of 2011, meaning which issue did they spend the most time debating on the floor of Congress and in committees? What was number one? And just, in case you guys are a little bit rusty in your history, let's remember the first quarter of 2011, right? We're in the middle of two wars, unemployment crisis in the United States. There was a debt crisis in the United States. We're about to, was one of the times we were about to exceed our debt limit. There's still a climate crisis. There's a poverty crisis. Basically, there's crises, lots of different crises in the United States in the first quarter of 2011. So all the possible things that Congress might be spending its time on, what was the number one issue it spent its time on? And the answer, from, I think it was in the reading, was the bank swipe fee controversy. So what was the bank swipe fee controversy? When you use a debit card, the banks get paid a certain amount of money from the retailers. That's set by law. So the bank swipe fee controversy is whether that rate should go up or should go down. And there's this fight, dominates the congressional agenda because the bank people want the rates to go up and the retail people want the rates to go down. And this becomes the number one issue that Congress addresses. Okay, now, why is it the number one issue that Congress addresses? Like, what possible reason is there? Why would Congress spend its time doing that? Because let me say something, it might be controversial, but I believe this is true. There is no member of the United States Congress who decided to go to Congress to resolve the question of the bank swipe fee controversy. Not one of them woke up one day and said, this is it, my purpose in life. I'm going to get that down to 4.2%. That's all it's going to be. There was not one. And I would bet there weren't 5 who mentioned it in their campaigns. So this is not an important issue to them. Why was it the number one issue Congress addressed? And this one has lots of very big money behind it, right? Banks and retail companies are rich. So what members would find is if they go on the floor of Congress and they begin to waffle a little bit, move from one side to the other, millions of dollars would rain down upon them by the other side. So it was a dance for the purpose of fundraising. It was the fundraising dance. You used to have rain dances, right? This is the fundraising dance. This is the rain-making dance. You just go and you talk about the issue, you identify where you are, and then people have targets and they start flooding you. And the interesting thing about this really great piece by Zach and Ryan Grimm talks about how these policy issues never end in Washington, right? They do this fight one cycle, then they pick it up again the next cycle. It's just like the doc fix. It's just like the temporary tax provisions. These are devices to continue to flush money into the system. Okay, so when you begin to think like that, here's the most obvious way in which money matters. The most obvious way in which money matters is that it affects the agenda of what Congress does. To the extent Congress is selecting the issues it talks about or works on in order to make it easier to raise money, that is a significant effect. So why don't you pay attention to unemployment, Congress? This is the answer. Unemployed people, by definition, don't have a lot of money. Don't have a lot of money. Okay, so number one, distraction in the work that they're doing, in addition to the stuff I talked about last time about the amount of time they spend raising money, but distraction in the sense of changing the agenda. And then the more fundamental thing that we all in our gut sort of believe, but Ancillary et al. Were trying to suggest didn't exist, is distortion. Okay, so first, we can see the distortion, and before we say first, let's see the distortion. Distortion, by definition, implies a baseline against which you're measuring the distortion. So you're saying Congress would be doing this, but for this influence distorting it, or in our compass model with magnetic deviation, Congress would be going north except for the magnet, which leads it to tilt a little bit northwest. Okay, so distortion implies a baseline. And by distortion here, what I mean is what Congress would be doing if Congress really were just worrying about what we're really just dependent on the people alone. We're really dependent in the way that Madison said they would be and not dependent in these other ways. Okay, so here's one way to measure the distortion. this is Baumgartner and a bunch of people in the book that they published, map the lobbying versus public's interest about certain issues. So if the influence on Congress were reflective of the issues people cared about, the black bar and the gray bars would be the same. To the extent they're different, what that's showing is people care about things different from the things that are actually being influenced in Congress. So here's one crude way to get a sense that the influence game is very different from the game that would reflect what people really cared about. And along every one of these dimensions, every one of these issues, there's this huge gap between what the public thinks is important and what the lobbyists are thinking is important. Okay, but then that begs this really important question. What do we think the lobbyists are actually doing? And maybe one of the best papers in the whole field is this paper by Hall and Deardorff about how to think of lobbying. And the point they make in this paper is that we should just think of lobbying as a kind of subsidy, private subsidy of legislative activity. And what they mean by that is, you're a congressperson, you go to Congress, you want to deal with the piracy problem, the copyright piracy problem. It's a complicated problem. You don't know how much piracy there is. You don't know what the real effects of this is. The lobbyists come into your office and they help you with that. They say, look, we can give you the data. We can give you the arguments. We can give you the legislation. We can give you the analysis. We can give you the polling data. We can give you all these things that make it better, easier for you to do what you want to do, which is to deal with the piracy problem. So in this sense, they're saying we should think about lobbying as a subsidy of the legislative process. Because if the lobbyists weren't doing it, the government would have to do it. And the government, turns out, doesn't have a huge staff. Members of Congress don't have a huge staff to do this stuff. So Congress wouldn't know the things they need to know in order to do the legislating in the way that they want to do their legislating. So this is a way to make it easier for Congress people to do the stuff they want to do because we subsidize them in the process of them doing it. Now, that might make this all sound pretty benign. Because if all you're doing is subsidizing the representative so that the representative can do what the representative otherwise would want to do, what could be wrong with that? You're helping the representative be the representative wants to be. But as they argue, as they acknowledge, you can see the way representation can be compromised without individual representatives being compromised. And here's the way to intuition for that. Let's say you're elected Congress, you're Mary Bono, elected Congresswoman from Los Angeles. And you go to Congress and you care about two issues. Number one, you care about protecting copyright owners. And number two, you care about poor women, single moms, and their kids. So the first day of your life in Congress, you hang out your sign that says open for business, and the lobbyists line up. And let's say that if you said to Mary Bono, so Mary Bono, which issue do you really, really care about? She's a decent woman. She would say, I really, really care about mothers and their kids. That's really what I care about. But when she opens her door for business, how many lobbyists are there pushing issues related to mothers and their kids? Almost none. And how many lobbyists are there pushing copyright protection? Many, many, many. So the point that they make, the point that this is meant to make is even though, in some sense, the subsidy is just subsidizing what the congressperson really wants, the difference in the subsidy across issues could shift the congressperson away from the mix of issues the congressman would otherwise want to be supporting. So you might think, I really want to go there and help mothers with kids. That's really too hard, but this copyright issue is really helpful. I've got all the data I need, all the polling I need, so I do a lot more work on the copyright issue than I otherwise would do if it weren't for this particular subsidy. So this subsidy is steering the congressperson in a way that might be different from what the congressperson otherwise would be doing. So in that sense, they say that representation can be compromised. This congressperson is not representing according to the mix that they otherwise would, even though the individual representatives are not compromised. Or put more directly, lobbying distorts representatives' allocation of effort in favor of groups sufficiently resource rich that they can finance inexpensive lobbying operation. So some issues get more support than others. That's just the nature of the way lobbying works. Okay, that's point number one. Then Deardorff say, but the implication of this whole analysis is the objective of lobbying is not to change the legislator's mind, but to assist natural allies in achieving their own coincident objectives. So this idea that a lobbyist walks in and says, yeah, I know you support copyright, but I'm going to give you $200,000 in campaign funding if you vote against copyright, Hall and Deardorff say that just never happens. Lobbyists are not there to switch anybody's votes. All the lobbyists are there to do is to take their natural allies and support them more effectively, give them more support. So they're about building and solidifying their, quote, base. And to that extent, again, you might say, well, then what's corrupting about that? They're just reinforcing the home team. But here's the puzzle. What does natural mean here? Right, so he says, assist their natural allies. What are the natural allies on the bank swipe fee controversy? Or on sugar tariffs? Or on tax extenders for depreciation? Or the doc fix? What are the natural allies here? And the point to recognize is that there's no such thing as nature in a world where Congress people can see which issues are more valuable to them. Remember this woman, Leslie Byrne, said when she went to Congress, she was told by a colleague, always lean to the green, and then reminded us that guy was not an environmentalist. What is she saying? She's saying this guy is telling you lean to the green, meaning in advance understand on which side of the issue you need to be in order to raise the most money. Once you mark yourself on that side, then you're the, quote, natural ally, according to Hall and Deardorff. So you could say that the influence the lobbyist gives at that point is not changing the view, but all the influence to change the view was done in advance because they know the value of the contribution before they actually take a position on it. And then there's a question of, well, where, in fact, does this influence get exercised? How does it get exercised? This guy's Larry Pressler. He's recently famous because if you saw the movie American Hustle about Abscam, he was the one senator who, when they did the Abscam pitch to sort of give him money in exchange for privileges, kind of looks up and says, whoa, 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 this is a crime. What are you talking about? I'm out of here. And he walks out. This is the one guy who did that. Okay. He was a senator from South Dakota. And I interviewed him for my book. And he said, this is the way in which influence happens in Washington. He says, he was talking about health care. And he says, there should have been an up or down vote on single-payer health insurance. He's a Republican. This is what he's saying. Or at least a vote on cloture, meaning a vote to close the issue. There was neither. For some reason, it just went away. Barack Obama abandoned it completely, although he said he was for it. Some Republicans are for it. I was for it way back, and Nixon was for it on a much more significant basis. Bob Packwood had a plan for it. But the point is, when they really started doing the health care bill, everybody disappeared who was for a single-payer system. I would suspect because the insurance company contributions, especially to the Democrats, signaled that they were not even permitted to mention the issue. The issue was completely moved off the table. And again, it was moved off the table because of the threat, the implicit threat of the way funding would come if that issue were made manifest. Okay, so first of all, that's the way the mechanism happens inside of Congress. But if you step outside of Congress and say, well, what's the evidence that this actually has had an effect? This paper, which then became a book, is quite impressive. So what Guylands did is Guylands went and he looked at all these surveys across a 30-year period that measured attitudes of Americans about what the government should do. Which way should the government act? And he found 1,781 surveys. And of the 1,781 surveys, 887 of these surveys were surveys where the attitudes of the richest quintile, top 20%, conflicted with the attitudes of the bottom 80%. So 80% of America said we should go left. 20% of America said we should go right. I don't mean left and right politically. I'm just saying they thought we should go one direction. 80% thought we should go the other direction. So you'd think in a democracy, what the vast majority, 80%, thinks would channel what, in fact, we do. But when they ran the numbers to look at these differences, what they found was when Americans with different income levels differ in their policy preferences, actual policy outcomes strongly reflect the preferences of the most affluent, but bear virtually no relationship to the preferences of poor or middle income Americans. So what that's saying is, if you can tell me what the top quintile think, I'm pretty sure I know how Congress is going to act. If you tell me what the middle income or bottom income Americans think, I have no clue from that about how Congress is going to act. So there's no relationship, not a small relationship, no relationship between the attitudes and what Congress in fact does. There's a vast discrepancy between the prediction of what Congress would do if Congress were actually a majoritarian enterprise and, let me get to some of the accounts and then you can pick up, and what in fact Congress really does. This is the thing that they've manifested in this particular book. Did you want to ask a question about that? Because I was going to add one more bit to the argument before. Okay, so this is suggesting policy is going to channel its direction in a way following what the very wealthy here think. This is reaffirmed by this really fantastic book, Hacker and Pearson's book. Hacker and Pearson introduced this nice little concept of the difference between broadland and richistan. That's propaganda font, if you want to know what that is. But broadland is Obama font. Okay, so that's the Obama font versus propaganda font. So broadland is a place, they say, where everybody is basically getting better off. Not necessarily at the same rate, but they're all basically getting better off. And richistan is a country where only the very wealthy are getting better off. Everybody else is kind of holding the line or falling back. And what Hacker and Pearson say is that the United States was broadland until about 1974, and then we became richistan. So we were a country where basically everybody was getting better off, and then we became a country where only the very rich and the very, very, very rich are getting very, very, very much better off, but everybody else is kind of holding the line. So then the question is, why was that? What accounts for it? And the first intuition you have, people spending a lot of money in education, is it must be the smart people. So the smart people are the rich people. Government's just doing what the smart people say. But as you can summarize this, Hacker and Pearson tried to figure this out. Maybe the rich are better educated. Maybe the education produces the difference in rewards. But the rich in Hacker and Pearson's account are not what most people would call rich. The rich are the super rich, 0.1% or 0.01%. Those people are not better educated than the top 1%. And Guylands finds fewer than 1/3 of Americans in the top income decile are also in the top education decile. So that means being smart doesn't mean you're going to be rich. I'm sorry if that was promised to you early on, but here it is. Being smart, being well educated does not mean you're going to be rich. So the fact that policy is tracking what the rich think does not mean policy is tracking what the educated think. So this is not just policy doing what the best educated think it should do. So what accounts for it, this is the amazing punchline, what accounts for it is changes in government policy. We became richistan because the government changed a bunch of its policies. And why did the government change a bunch of its policies? Well, nobody can know, but the beneficiaries of those changes happen to be the richest people in the country. And the richest people in the country were the people contributing to the campaigns most vigorously. So if contributions to the campaigns are affecting the policy, it's the contributions to the campaigns that are making the policy shift in a way that's benefiting and creating this vast gap between the rich and the rest. So government policy begins to explain the inequality point. They've got a recent paper that sort of reasserts this. Multivariate analysis indicates economic elites and organized groups representing business interests have substantial independent impacts on government policy, while average citizens and mass-based interest groups have little or no independent influence. So the money is mattering in creating the inequality, which everybody looks at the United States and thinks is a big problem. So did you?
Yeah. What of the sort of legislation because the interest, you're talking about the top 20% and bottom 80. The interests of the bottom 80 are fairly singular. They're pretty united in the economy, government corruption. When you looked at across party lines, you've got $1 trillion farm bill that went through this last January with like no public discussion, unanimous consent in the Senate, and it satiated the issues of Republicans and Democrats at the same time, whether through food stamps, through the Democrat, $800 billion of food stamps over the next 10 years for the Democrats, or farm subsidies and other legislation for the Republicans. No one batted an eye.
Yeah.
You know, and that goes through very quickly and quietly, and satiates that 80%, while the interests, the expensive interests that we laughed about here, are addressed by the other stuff.
Right, but
How do we address?
so the politics of the Farm Bill is a little complicated.
Yeah.
First of all, nobody wants to say they're against farmers. But the Farm Bill doesn't actually benefit farmers. Farm Bill is benefiting these massively powerful businesses. ADM, which is the strongest beneficiary, its former president, who was one of the biggest contributors to campaigns, said, you know, the United States is obviously a socialist nation, and we are the biggest beneficiaries of this socialism because they're basically giving all this money to the government through contributions and getting in return from the government these subsidies that make it so that they can do things like ethanol and keep the cost of coal low so that high fructose corn syrup becomes the natural substitute for sugar, et cetera, et cetera. So this is an example of the kind of low salience issue because most people don't understand this, so they don't have anything to care about it. And the people who do understand it, people like ADM, they exercise lots of power to advance it. The people who care about this, the part of the Farm Bill, though, are the food stamp people. And so the Democrats, I think, kind of think this is like their deal. They'll buy off the rich food companies in exchange for getting something for the poor in the food stamps. And that was the same dynamic that we saw when you looked at Obamacare, right? You make a deal with pharma, you make a deal with the insurance companies in order to get something for the poor. This is Robert Reich's point. You only get legislation when you can buy off the most important interests, fundamentally raising the cost of that legislation beyond what it otherwise would cost. Okay, that's distortion. The last point, very easy, this is from what we've seen before, is the way in which this money affects the trust of the institution. So here's confidence in Congress in the last 10 years. Not good news for Congress, right? And part of the argument here is that this drop-off in confidence is related to the way in which money has a role. So Rock the Vote, which in 2008 turned out the largest number of voters ever, young voters ever in the history of an election. Those numbers, if true, mean that Obama won because of Rock the Vote. Found in 2010, significant number of the young voters were not going to show up to vote. So they asked them why, they polled them. And the answer was, no matter who wins, corporate interests will still have too much power and prevent real change. So if you see a system where money is having such an overwhelming influence, you eventually learn, why waste my time? Why waste my time participating in that system? Because I don't trust that I have any efficacy in that system. I don't trust that if I intervene and try to push it in one way, my push will matter if there's $1 billion on the other side pushing the other way. So in this sense, the money, even if the money can't be linked between roll call votes and outcomes, the money certainly can be linked to the declining confidence people have in their government and willingness they have to engage with or participate in their government. Okay, so this was all in the section talking about how does money matter. One last point, and then we'll stop and open up for questions. What would you do about it? How could you fix it? Well, I think the analytics for how you fix it are pretty easy. Right? So if the problem, as we talked about last time, is members of Congress are spending way too much time fundraising, and fundraising from the Lesters alone, or maybe the Sheldons in the future, but fundraising from a tiny, tiny slice of America, so that the per capita contribution of the top 1% in campaigns is 10 times the per capita contribution of everybody else combined. So their influence from that perspective is 10 times the influence of 99% of America. then the solution to this is to find a way that they can spend less time fundraising. But if they're going to fundraise, they're going to try to find, we want them to fundraise from a wider slice of America. Not just from the Lesters, but from the Lesters and the Johns and the Jakes and the Marys and the, from the widest range of America. To spread out this funder influence to get to, hopefully, this objective of influence so that you could say Congress is dependent on the people alone. And to do this, the obvious solution that's been proposed is systems that create small dollar funded elections. Public funding to create small dollar funded elections or citizen funded campaigns. So a statute like the Fair Elections Now Act, which would make it so that small contributions are matched 6 to 1 by the government. So if you give $100, it's worth $700. Or the American Anti-Corruption Act that has a very large voucher program. Everybody gets a $100 voucher they can use to fund elections. In my book, I talked about something called the Grant and Franklin Project. Everybody gets a $50 voucher grant. And any candidate can take the voucher so long as they limit their contributions to vouchers and contributions of up to $100, Franklin. So you can fund your campaigns with vouchers and capped contributions of up to $100. That system would create $7 billion, which is 3 times the amount of money raised and spent in the last election. So it would be a lot of money, but it would come from a lot of people, not just from the Lesters. It would come from everybody. Or the most prominent bill in Congress right now is this John Sarbanes bill, by the Government by the People Act, which has a 9 to 1 match. It has a tax credit. It has a proposal, a pilot for a voucher program. So it's a very aggressive system for making it so people can fund their elections with small contributions only. Each of them would, in this sense, fix this corruption because it would be spreading out the funder influence. Everybody would be as equivalent. Every section would be as fundamentally effective as being a funder. Not exactly, but pretty close. Certainly much better than the current system where this tiny fraction of the 1% has this extraordinary influence. And if you could think about, I'm not going to take time now to do this, but I want you to think about a little how it would matter to the business model of fundraising. Right, so in 2012, Obama attended 221 fundraisers. It was a re-election campaign, 221 fundraisers. Ronald Reagan in his re-election campaign attended 0 fundraisers. 0. And the reason was Reagan had public funding, and Obama had given up public funding. If you have public funding, you can't raise money, so you don't go raise money. Obama did go raise money. And who are the people Obama was talking to in those fundraisers? They were not average Joe. They were the super exceptional Lester, or, well, he didn't talk to me, but they were super exceptional Sheldons. Those are the people they're talking to. The Republican Party, it's even more dramatic. You sort of look where Republican candidates were in the 2012 primary. They were not in Republican states. They were in California and in New York and in Boston. Why were they in those states? Because that's where the money was. They were spending all their time in the money states instead of in the voting states, because the money states is where they get the money in order to run their campaign. So if you had small dollar funded elections, the business model would be, how do I attract funding from the wide range of Americans? What do I do to convince this neighborhood to send me their vouchers? Right, so you'd have much stronger influence to connect. The business model would be to connect to a wider range of Americans, just like you try to connect to a wide range of Americans to get them to vote for you. So in this sense, I think the analytics to the problem are easy. It doesn't take rocket scientists to figure out how to solve the problem. It's the politics that's hard, maybe impossibly hard. Because any of the reform that I'm talking about would, see the way that kind of dramatically did that? Shrink the power of K Street. See, shrink? You got to time it well. Shrink the power of K Street. K Street where the lobbyists work. Right? Jim Cooper, Democrat from Tennessee, says the thing you've got to understand is that Capitol Hill has become a kind of farm league for K Street. What he means by that is that the members, the staffers, and the bureaucrats all have a common business model in their head, a business model focused on their life after government, their life as lobbyists. So 50% of the Senate between 98 and 2004, 42% of the House left to become lobbyists. Those numbers have only gone up. And as United Republic calculated in April of last year, the average salary increase for the members who they tracked as they left Capitol Hill to become lobbyists was 1,452%. So as you begin to think about people on this hill whose whole future, whole retirement depends on this system surviving, the hard problem is not figuring out how to fix the system. The hard problem is figuring out how is it possible to imagine them ever adopting the changes that would fix the system, because if they adopted those changes, their retirement package would not be a 1,452% pay raise. Their retirement package would be go back home and pick up where you left off before you went back to be a congressperson. So the hard, depressing, hard political reality here is not what's the answer, it's how. How is the answer ever possible? All right, that's all I want to say. Happy to take a couple questions before we break. Yeah.
What about super PACs?
Everything I said, but worse. Okay, but you notice, because the question notices.
They're not linked to candidates.
Right.
And so isn't it just like a slippery slope of to what extent is a super PAC? Like you could say if you have a candidate's name in the name of the super PAC, to pay us out, but then it's just such a continuum.
Yeah. So super PACs are a problem. We've got to find a way to fix them if we're going to fix this too. But by emphasizing, as I have these last 2 days, that the problem is the way they raise money to fund their campaigns, I've made it sound like super PACs are not really the problem. But what I mean is actually, even if you fix the problem of super PACs, even if the Supreme Court eventually gets it right and reverses the decision that creates these super PACs, you still have a much more difficult problem to address, which is to change the way you fund elections. Because 90% of Americans want to get rid of super PACs. But if you ask America, do they want to support citizen-funded campaigns? Do they want tax money to be used to publicly fund campaigns? Probably 40% would say they do want that. Right? So the problem is, the real ultimate problem here, the difficult challenge, change the way you fund elections, requires a radical change in the way Americans look at the problem. And the super PAC problem just requires the Supreme Court to flip one vote. And Elena Kagan, I told you about her, right? She's the one who was the dean of the Harvard Law School and convinced me to leave paradise to come to Cambridge. And I told you about that in the middle of the worst winter we've had in the last 20, okay? She, Supreme Court Justice, will get them on the right side eventually. I'm not worried about that. Right? What I'm worried about is once they're on the right side, there's still this problem. Still this problem. This is the really hard problem. So you're right, it is a problem. Super PACs are a problem. We could have a whole nother lecture about super PACs, but even if you solve that problem, there still is this underlying problem to solve. Okay, another question. Yeah.
So we talked the other day about historically the problem was you had public voting and people would essentially buy the votes. Why
Great question.
do we expect if you create this entire structure, you have $100 to donate, and I'll come here, I'll give you 20 if you sign this form which says it's my candidate.
Yep. So here's how to solve that problem. Remember, the voting, anonymous voting solved the problem of vote buying because there was no way to verify the contract. So if I say I'm going to sell you my vote for $5, I could tell you that I voted for your candidate, but I could also have voted for some other candidate and I could try to be collecting on both sides. So you couldn't verify the vote, the price goes down dramatically. So the solution to the voucher problem is to introduce the inability to verify, and here's how you do it. You say for any allocation, within 24 hours I have the right to reverse it. So even if I walk into a voucher booth with the candidate, here's my voucher, signed over to you, $100. You have $100. What you know is that I can go back and pick up the phone and reverse that, or click on the web and reverse that, and sell it to somebody else. And if I'm the sort of person who would sell it to you in violation of federal law, I'm likely also the person who's going to reverse my sale to you and go sell it to somebody else. And the details are you would never actually know that this particular person has reversed. You would just see that the numbers didn't go up as much as you thought they would go up. So the point is the market in selling vouchers could be totally decimated by just implementing it in a way that makes it so you can back out of the transaction. Now, it wouldn't be zero. It wouldn't be worth zero. But it wouldn't be worth $100. And it certainly wouldn't be worth it if, in addition to that, you added very severe criminal penalties for engaging in that kind of vote buying, just like you have severe criminal penalties now for vote buying. Yeah.
What if there were regulations put in place to like monitor how campaigns go so that you took away the super fund they still have to take campaigns?
Yeah, great question. So one of the reasons why there's a huge pressure to raise money is the campaigns are expensive. But the same court that created super PACs has almost made it impossible to effectively regulate the cost of campaigns. So you can't require that television stations carry television ads for free. You can't require that newspapers publish things for free. You can't require cable stations give you cable time for free. You can't restrict the length of a campaign, according to the First Amendment. So all of the things that other countries do, we can't do. So we can't systematically reduce the cost. Now, even if you could, though, the point is, regardless of how much it cost, if the Lesters are funding it, the Lesters are having the same effect. So if you cut the amount by a third, still, if it's the Lesters funding the third, then the Lesters have the same effect they have when they're funding it at 3 times. So if you could address that problem, it would create less pressure, so maybe they would spend less time fundraising, but unless you deal with the way fundraising happens, you haven't changed the corrupting influence of concentrating so much dependence in a tiny fraction of the 1%. Yes?
Professor, how, if you think about the voucher system, is it really any different than just another election that's happening?
It's brilliant, brilliant, exactly right, exactly right. This is exactly the point that I'm trying to get you to link from last class to this one, right? So once you've made that link, which you did, thank you for making that link. I'll pay you afterwards. Then you begin to see the intuition of how to solve the problem of the money election, what I call the green primary. Right? The problem isn't that there's a primary. The problem is that the people who participate in the primary are a tiny fraction of the 1%. So, when we dealt with the white primary, we didn't deal with the white primary by abolishing the Democratic primary. We dealt with the white primary by saying blacks and whites equally get to vote in the primary. And so the voucher basically turns the money, the green primary, into a primary that everybody is equally participating in. Now, the dynamics of that primary are quite interesting because if you think about it, the voting election happens on one day, primary day and voting, general election day. So everything happens on that one day. Everything hangs on what happens on one day. That creates a lot of pressure. But the money primary, the green primary, happens 24/7, continuously. Every day the congressperson is trying to persuade you to give him your voucher. So he has a constant new bite at the apple every single day, a new bite at the apple. How about this? How about this? How about this? What about this argument? So it's much more continuous. It's much more stable and strategically beneficial to people trying to figure out how to persuade the largest number of people to come into their camp. So it becomes like an election, but unlike an election, it's an election over lots of time. And one way to think about it is, anybody who goes after this place to Oxford or Cambridge, you'll see undergraduates there have a system where they go to university for 3 years and they have one exam at the end. One exam. And that's it. Your whole grade is on the basis of that one exam. Everything else is just prelude. And if you're sick on that day you take that exam, too bad, so sad. You get something called an IGRATAT, which is basically you were there for 3 years, but we don't know how you did. Because we don't have that exam. But you have a different system. You have exams all the time. You have ways of measuring it all the time. So what happens on one particular day doesn't really matter as much. That's the difference between the voting election and the voucher primary. Like it's a continuous feedback that's much more reliable, I think, in measuring something than that ultimate vote would be. But you still would have the ultimate vote. That would be the thing that really matters, but it would be buttressed by a bunch of those things. Okay. You had a question, but if you want to stay afterwards, I'm happy to.
I hate to keep everyone.
Okay, great. Let's take it up afterwards. Thanks very much.